Hey everyone, welcome to Singularity Computers Client Build 21 Part 5. As you can see, the system is close to completion. I just need to finish the custom wiring and cable management and install the lighting. So this video will cover the completion of the build and the test results. I wanted to start this video by briefly discussing and clearing something up that I talked about previously in the build log. A few people commented on this and actually corrected me. I mentioned that I build all of my cables completely custom from the ground up, except usually for a couple of cable types, SATA data cables, because I said that I didn't know any way of actually customizing them or building them custom from the ground up, but it turns out there are actually components that make this possible, and I'll put a link in the video description to these components. No doubt you'll see me doing this in build logs coming up. The other cable was fan extension cables, and I mentioned that I don't build them from the ground up. I use pre-built fan extensions and customize them, cut them to length and sleeve them, because otherwise you have to solder on the pins for one of the connectors. But this is not actually true. There is another way that I had actually forgotten about. I was doing it years ago, but I actually stopped because I didn't like how big and bulky the connector is, and you will see what I mean. The soldered type is actually a fair bit more streamlined, but it's a small sacrifice to make to be able to build custom fan cables. And you can see I'm taking you through the technique right now. It turns out I actually have the components to do it on my own store, but it's just like building any other custom cable. There are two different types of fan pins, male and female. So using the male pins in combination with a fan socket connector, you can easily build a fan extension cable without doing any soldering. And in my opinion, fan extension cables are one of the most important cables to be able to build custom. It's quicker to build them from the ground up than modifying an existing cable. These are cables that are usually a long cable going from one side of the build to the other. You usually have quite a lot of them, and it's important that they are the correct length, because you might be running them to splitters, to the motherboard. Often they are in full view, but they're one of those cables that you just really want to get out of sight as much as possible. So being able to build these custom from the ground up is a great thing to do, and I'm definitely going to go back to using these socket connectors. The Mayhem's X1 UV green coolant is definitely going to be a big feature in this build. I mean, whenever I use UV reactive coolant, it always is, but UV green coolant gives the best UV reaction. I have seen some good UV red back in the day, but still UV green sticks out more than anything else. So I was really looking forward to testing out and installing the UV lighting in this build. There's no question about it. I'm definitely going to use dark side because it's by far the best UV lighting. They have just perfected it. The UV reaction from this lighting, take a look at the position I've installed it here. It's hardly even pointed in the direction of the coolant, the water cooling loop, yet still an amazing reaction. Just great lighting. I'm modifying the cables. They do their cables very well, and the sleeving that they use looks good. They actually have the best cables out of really any of the components that I've seen, but still I want all of my sleeving to match right through the build, so I'm replacing it with MDPCX black. I just wanted to show you there that trying to get that sleeving off over the connector, it doesn't stretch. That's one of the amazing things about MDPCX. It stretches to something like 4 times its size, so you can actually push it over connectors. It just makes it really easy to use. So you can see that I've modified the cables with MDPC. In the last part of the build log, I mentioned that I had a problem with the D5 pump when I was filling the loop. It was only running at 2% of its RPM, which I found out is a common problem with a lot of the new D5 pumps when they're not getting a signal to the PWM. So this is the custom cable that I was talking about that I built to give a signal to the PWM. So on one end it has a Molex pin which you plug into the 5 volt on the Molex that you run the pump from. On the other end it has a fan socket connector, and the wire goes to the green cable on the PWM connector. The system is now complete, so I've finished the custom wiring and the cable management, and I've also installed the lighting, and I'm really happy with the way it's turned out. Mainly the mods, the side panel window mod, such a simple mod. I was kind of questioning my choice of using the full black and also the gloss, because it doesn't match the paint job on the case, which is more of an anthracite or slate. It's not a full black, and it's also a matte finish. But I'm happy with the way this looks. It matches the finish on the acrylic, obviously, and a lot of the other components in the build. So let's take a look at the custom cables, which for this build were a massive job. They always are, but there was a lot of little extras. You know, the lighting in this build, I spent a lot of time on that. I ended up removing some of it, but there's a lot of high-end components in this build in a small case. I mean, you can certainly build a high-end system into a mid-tower like this, but it's the custom wiring that ends up a lot more cramped than anything else. But if you do it properly and lay it out right, you can certainly get around it. You have to consider though that we do have two GTX 980 Ti's, we have two SSDs and an SSHD, we have the 6 radiator fans. There's a lot going on here. And you know, to get the custom wiring even this clean was a huge amount of work. Everything is fully customized to length, so it's as short as it can possibly be. There's no way to get it any cleaner. I mean, we have fan splitters back here. Basically, the entire power supply, all of the plugs are taken up pretty much, except for a few of the PCIe plugs. And so, you know, certainly a lot of cables, so many that when I was plugging in the last few cables, I couldn't even get my hands in to plug them in. It was actually very difficult. But this is always the way when building a high-end system with a high-end water cooling system as well into smaller cases. To build this water cooling loop, I used Bits Power Black Sparkle fittings and Bits Power 16mm tube. It was really a breeze to build because there's only 4 lengths of tube, and with the combination of fittings that I used, the bends are just very simple bends. It was a very fun loop to build. So let's take a look at the fittings that I've used. Coming out of the front radiator, a 5mm extension and a 45-degree fitting, which I don't often use. Then a 90-degree dual rotary. A complex fittings configuration to get up and over that SSHD. Going into the bottom of the graphics cards, another 90-degree single rotary, and then I've dropped back to 12mm tube. And I did this because this was the only way to show tube here. If you use 16mm, the fittings actually cover the entire tube, and I don't like any of the other options for this build. They're not as elegant, you know, because they're just complete fittings. You don't get to see any tube. So dropping down to 12mm, considering that it's in parallel, you're certainly not going to lose any flow. I love parallel for the extra flow, for the extra strength, and for the aesthetics. You can see there's about an 8mm offset in this length of tube, and doing a big offset is quite easy, but a small offset like this was difficult. It actually took me a couple of tries to get it. Coming out of the top radiator, I have a 30mm extension, 90-degree single rotary, then another one, then a 5mm extension, and then coming out of the CPU water block, I have a 5mm extension in combination with a 30mm extension. I didn't have any 35mm extensions, so I had to combine the two. Another 90-degree single, and then 2 more 90-degree singles going back into the top of the reservoir. And then around the back here for the drainage system, something that my clients always request is an easy to use, easy to access drainage system that works properly. So that means that it has to be installed at the lowest point, and usually it means using a lot of fittings to be able to get a really good, easy to use drainage system. And you can see that's just what I've done here. A 90-degree single rotary, 90-degree dual, a 1-inch D plug, and then a T fitting. It's the first time I've used this type of fitting before. Bits Power mini valve and a 45 and 2 90-degree singles. So quite a lot of fittings, and it took me a lot of time to actually figure this out. This was really the only way that I could do it. So the system is up and running, and I'm in the process of doing the testing. I do 72 hours of stability testing, but then if the customer requests an overclock, I have to do another 72 hours, and depending on how high I push the overclock, it can sometimes take over a week of testing, because it means, you know, doing the initial testing, but then overclocking, and then each time you change the settings for an overclock, you really need to do all of the testing again. And so as I push it higher and higher and try to get the maximum out of the components, it just means more and more testing. So definitely the testing takes a big chunk of the time for these builds, but I'm definitely happy with the positioning of the UV lighting. There's only a couple of parts of the loop, just tiny parts of it that are actually in the dark, so it's worked out nicely. I have one dark side UV LED strip at the back and one at the top. I could have put one at the front, but I tested that. It didn't work too well. And one at the bottom just wouldn't really have worked at all because the power supply shroud is kind of in the way. So looks amazing in the dark. I mean, the UV green always looks amazing, and this is exactly what we were going for this build with the black and green color scheme. The UV lighting and UV coolant was definitely going to be important. And I actually ended up modifying the lighting in behind the Razer logos because it ran for the first few days and then it just suddenly stopped working. And I actually removed a lot of the stock lighting from this case, but I took the opportunity to modify the lighting. I put a brighter LED in, so those logos are a lot brighter now. I know a lot of people don't like Razer, I've seen from the comments, but it's just what the customer requested. And the two logos and also the lighting for the rear I/O actually have a power switch so that you can switch them on and off. It's time to take a look at the test results. Definitely some epic results there, some massive gains from the overclocks. I mean, you can see what is possible with overclocking when you have a high-end water-cooled system. I mean, this is a very potent build. And I didn't even push the overclocks that far. 4.4 gigahertz on the CPU. It could have gone a lot further. I mean, I ended up at 1.3 volts. And for the graphics cards, only 50 megahertz over on the core and the memory. And I was running the memory at its XMP profile of 2400 megahertz C11. So also excellent temperature results. I'm very happy with that. Now, you would have noticed that some of the overclock results are lower. That's because those results are based on time. And the hard drive tune results, not sure what happened there. I mean, that often happens with hard drive tune. It is old software, but the other results for the SSDs and the M.2 look very good. And so that is about it. It's time to wrap up this build log. So again, as always, this has been a great system to build. You know, I enjoyed doing the mods, even though there was only minor mods for this build, but it was nice to build into a mid-tower case. I mean, usually I'm building either ITX or massive case labs builds, so it's great to do something in between. You know, it's not, I haven't done many mid-tower builds on my channel, really. I have some epic builds coming up that I'm really looking forward to. GTX 1080. Now, this build ended up taking, well, I kept it a lot longer than I intended because I moved house, so you can see that I'm actually in the new house filming now. And that happened, well, because those LEDs failed, as I mentioned, and I was ready to send it off. It was done. And I ended up having to pull it apart again and, you know, redo a lot of the cable management to get to those LEDs. So it ended up taking a lot more time. But anyway, another build that was a lot of fun. Remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons, so a massive thanks to them. Thanks for watching.